Good evening, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the Chair of the Entangled History of Ukraine at the Viadrina European University to this session of the online Ukrainian Studies Colloquium. I am delighted on behalf of the Chair to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Serhy Yekelchyk, who is a professor of history and Germanic and Slavic studies at the University of Victoria in Canada. He received his first degree from the University of Kiev, the Taras Shevchenko University of Kiev, and his master's at the Institute of History of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, where he wrote on the historiography, the English language historiography of the social and political movements and the national liberation struggle in Ukraine in the capitalist period under Vitaly Sarbey. Then he did postgraduate research at Monash University in Australia in the early 1990s, and then wrote his PhD supervised by John Paul Himka at the University of Alberta on history, culture and identity under high Stalinism in Soviet Ukraine 1938 to 1953. He was a postdoctoral fellow and visiting assistant professor at the University of Michigan. And since 2001, he's taught at the University of Victoria. We were looking, Dr. Yekelchyk, at the covers of some of your books before you arrived. Various people were sharing them from their collections, but some that I should mention are your 1994 work in Ukrainian, The Awakening of a Nation Toward a Theory of the Ukrainian National Movement in the Second Half of the 19th Century, published at Monash University. Stalin's Empire of Memory, Russian-Ukrainian Relations in the Soviet Historical Imagination, 2004. Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation in 2007, the first English language history of Ukraine to contain a narrative of the Orange Revolution. Ukrainophiles, The World of Ukrainian Patriots in the Second Half of the 19th Century in 2010. Stalin's Citizens, Everyday Politics in the Wake of Total War, Oxford University Press in 2014. The Conflict in Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know, which is now in its second edition, but first published in 2015. And then more recently in 2018, published in Kiev by Laurus, Everyday Stalinism, Kiev and Kievans After the Great War. And tonight, we are looking forward to hearing you talk to us about Stalinist culture in Ukraine, a reappraisal. And we have been told that you will strongly welcome our comments and our questions afterwards. And with that, I think you're going to talk to us for about 30 or 40 minutes. The floor is yours, and thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much, Ursula. Thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Andrei, and your team for the invite. Thank you all for showing up today. Lots of familiar faces in the audience, much appreciated. This talk is important for me in a sense that it sums up the results of texts I was trying to write on and off for a decade now. I've published a series of articles on various aspects of Ukrainian culture in Stalin's time, never collected them into a book because they were really case studies which gave examples of how writers, historians, in one case, the composers and poets, were working to satisfy the demands of the state, but at the same time, understanding themselves as the creators of a Soviet Ukrainian culture. and all the tensions built into this situation of the state and the actual cultural producers being engaged in a very tense dialogue, and one side possessing all kinds of repressive means. These case studies do come together, but I really needed to write finally that one paper which would serve as a kind of opening and an introduction of sorts, which would deal with the essential features of Ukrainian Stalinist culture. And here I mean the Ukrainian culture shaped by Stalinist officials and Stalinist culture producers. And this paper, and I have presented it like maybe 2 or 3 times in the past. I think the first time centuries ago at Kyiv Mohyla Academy in a different life. And I don't remember whether Andriy was back then still at the Center for Polish and European Studies, but his presence could be felt because students were asking very good questions. And so today I'm trying to attempt a little bit of a roadmap to the book, which finally will come together perhaps in a year or so. And in so doing, I would really appreciate your comments on the structure of what I'm going to say today and on what I may be missing or perhaps overemphasizing. All of these are very real possibilities. So I'm going to start with one particular episode from 1940, which would involve a famous Ukrainian poet being held at a mental institution. And his name is Volodymyr Sosura. He is a famous lyrical poet in Ukraine who had all kinds of difficulties with the Soviet power, who, like many Ukrainian writers, was fighting in the army of the Ukrainian People's Republic during the revolution. So all kinds of wrong background, but a beautiful lyrical talent. And so he was considered needed by the party. But he finds himself after the early 1930s in a situation of being expelled from the Communist Party for his past mistakes. And being in a position of a pariah, really, kind of not fully accepted as a member of the establishment. And Stalinist writers do consider themselves members of the establishment, by the way, those who survived the terror. And so in 1940, Sosura is making desperate attempts to talk to Nikita Khrushchev, at the time the party boss of Ukraine. He tries to meet him, he keeps calling his office, but every time he's advised to talk to one of his assistants, not to Khrushchev himself, but rather to Gapochka or Nazarenko. But he doesn't agree with that. He feels that only Stalin's immediate and direct representative in Ukraine, Nikita Khrushchev, could be the person to talk to. And when he is unable to get to Khrushchev, he writes a letter to Stalin. This letter ends with a very telling line, and this very telling line starts as a beginning of my talk and in a sense of the book as well. The letter ends with the words, "You are my only salvation and my refuge. Father, save me." This letter to Stalin is dispatched by the usual Soviet channels, and the reply does arrive fairly soon. The reply apparently consists of a very short resolution on the letter, which reads, "Restore in the party to be treated." To be treated means the mental issues of Sosura. So he's removed from the mental institution, dressed in a very nice clothes, and made again a member of the establishment. He writes that that was the moment which made him happy. But to me, that's the moment which signifies something really important about Stalinist culture in general, and Stalinist culture in Ukraine in particular. That's the moment when he reestablishes a symbolic connection with the highest leadership, with Stalin himself directly, not even with Khrushchev. In a very nice clothes, and made again. Okay. So in a sense, my starting point here is that a Stalinist culture in Ukraine was Stalin's culture. That is, all the manifestations of Ukrainian national culture existed in a symbolic dialogue with the Soviet power and ideally with Stalin himself. In the previous decade, it would be the chief of propaganda or agitation department or the Department of Culture, Andrei Khvylya, most notably in Ukraine, who would be, in fact, a patron of arts. But now, going into the late 1930s, it's going to be directly Stalin and some people in his immediate surroundings, such as Voroshilov, very notably. And so this means that establishing some kind of a symbolic link is important. It makes you Stalin's writer, not just a Stalinist writer, but actually a Stalin's writer. And we have to say that, yes, indeed, Stalin was following up very closely on the developments in Ukrainian culture. And he did so in a variety of ways. For one thing, he would occasionally promote people just by his own decision. There are two famous cases of that. One with the singer Boris Hmyra, an opera singer who stayed under the German occupation, actually performed under the German occupation, was subsequently not in favor of the Soviet authorities. After an appearance in Moscow in the early 1950s, the usual list arrived at Stalin's desk to give honorific titles to a number of Ukrainian actors and writers performing in Moscow. And it was proposed to give to Hmyra the title of the People's Artist of the Ukrainian Republic, which Stalin crossed out and changed it with People's Artist of the Soviet Union, jumping through one stage, just because he liked the voice. The second case also comes from the post-war period, and that is Sergei Bondarchuk, the subsequently famous film director, who started as an actor in Ukraine. So he performed the role of Shevchenko in a famous Soviet movie from 1951 about Taras Shevchenko. And a Soviet magazine crossed Stalin's desk, on which there was a portrait of Bondarchuk, and it was indicated that he was a meritorious worker of arts of the Ukrainian Republic, which Stalin crossed out right away and wrote instead the People's Artist of the Soviet Union. So he did such things. He did such things intentionally, but he also did different things. He invited, for instance, Dovzhenko in January 1944 to his office in the Kremlin in presence of the full Politburo and a selected group of Ukrainian writers to give him a dressing down, to explain to Dovzhenko that his film script, Ukrainian Flames, was faulty. It was a nationalistic script. It put nation before class and before Soviet loyalty. Now, the interesting thing about it is nobody was allowed to publish anything about the meeting. Yet, it was actually a meeting with the Ukrainian writers and other cultural figures. So the Ukrainian literary and cultural establishment knew what happened at the meeting. Nobody could talk about it. And that, of course, was part of Stalin's mystique, in the same way changing the honorific titles was part of his mystique as well. This had to be not only a symbolic connection, but also, in a way, mystical. In 1951, Censura will become a victim of that again. Stalin was reading a Russian literary journal and discovered in this Russian literary journal a translation of Censura's poem from 1944, a highly patriotic poem. Now, I have to say that Censura, since then, have revised the poem to make it less Ukrainian patriotic and more Soviet by mentioning the other Soviet nationalities. But Stalin was reading the translation from the first edition, 1944. And so the poem Love Ukraine, that was the title, became the subject of immediate scandal and ideological campaign when all the literary and cultural figures in Soviet Ukraine had to undergo rounds of criticism and self-criticism, making sure that they are not too much of Ukrainian patriots at the expense of the Soviet national idea. So Stalin did have a role, but this role was important and symbolic. We do not, in fact, know that the letter reached him. We do not know what the resolution really was, other than somebody told Saussure later that that's what it was. And to add to this mystic and symbolic character of this interaction, let me also say that Kornichuk and Dovzhenko at other points in their career also interacted directly with Stalin, making sure that the cultural product they were going to produce would be satisfactory and would have his personal support. But what is really striking when studying Stalinist culture is a number of people who claim to have been saved by Stalin or by Khrushchev. The list is enormously long, and it makes it possible to call Stalinist culture in Ukraine the culture of the survivors, but not just the survivors, but the culture of the saved, of those saved by the leader. So at various points in their biography, Rylsky twice claimed to have been saved by Stalin or Khrushchev. So did Malishko and Stelmach. Dovzhenko did it twice as well. In one case, allegedly it was Stalin. In the other case, the head of the Ukrainian NKVD, Balitsky, who allegedly saved him. Even Kornichuk, or at least his family, his third wife, subsequently claimed that his arrest was being prepared, but he was saved by Stalin's personal intervention. There is no evidence whatsoever for that. Interestingly enough, Khrushchev, twice in his memoir, claims that he saved at certain point Rylsky from arrest by telling Stalin that Rylsky wrote a poem about Stalin, which became a popular song. Now, what do we make of this obsession over Soviet literary figures? And actually, in the case of Stelmach, the prose writer, his family now claims that the order for his arrest was signed as well. That tends to be the first line of argument. The order for the arrest was already signed. But then Stalin gave him a Stalin Prize for Literature. And so he was not arrested because of Stalin's personal divine intervention. And of course, what is behind this notion of being saved, of having been saved, is of course the fear. The fear and the acknowledgement of how fragile the position of any Soviet arts official or Soviet cultural figure has in fact been at the time. So it's at the same time the culture of those frightened. So much so that Tychina, perhaps the greatest poet of the time, perhaps also the worst example of the person forever scared by Stalinism, is that even in the 1960s, when there is no danger of terror, he is friends with Oles Gonchar, a prominent Ukrainian writer at the time, a totally different generation of war veterans. And he keeps talking to Gonchar, and his wife subsequently tells Gonchar as well that whenever he was thinking about you, he would always say one thing: he should be careful, he should really be cautious. Sometimes, Lydia Tychina would say, Tychina would wake up at night and say, I worry about Gonchar so much. He's like a son to me, but he should really be cautious. He shouldn't be that bold. And so that's also the culture in which, as we know, people were denouncing each other. People were acting as secret informers of the NKVD. And that added yet another dimension of fear and disbelief, mistrust into Stalinist culture. I wouldn't go into this particular moment in too much detail. There is a famous story, of course, of Bajan being deputy premier as well as a poet, having to denounce his best friend, Smolich, as well as Rylsky, and how these people would subsequently actually deal with Bajan, and how Bajan would subsequently confess to Gonchar and others about whether it's possible for him to visit Rylsky when Rylsky is dying, whether Rylsky would talk to him, and what Rylsky said about it, and what Smolich said, and what Bajan's own mother said, because Smolich says, I forgive you. I understand you had to do it. You had to denounce me publicly and publish all these articles and claim that I am the enemy. But according to contemporaries, Bajan's own mother does not forgive him and tells him constantly that he was your best friend. You used to live together in the same apartment. Now you betrayed him. And the subsequent banks of regret do mark the post-Stalinist period as well, not just the Stalinist period. And finally, in this part of the talk then, it's also the culture of empty chairs. The empty chairs that mark the limits of possible, because there are people who disappeared, most notably, let's say, Kurbas, or Kosinka, or Zerov. And because everybody knew them and knew what they actually did, that's not necessarily what they were accused of, because of course Kosinka was accused of being a Russian monarchist in 1934, which was totally nonsensical. But the point is that everybody realized, so they were targeted for some reason. They were more visible than the others in doing this or doing that. And therefore, there are gradations and there are markers, borders, that are marked with these empty chairs of the people who used to be around and used to be doing these things, but now you cannot do them anymore. So this limits very notably included, of course, modernism, and included apolitical, non-political, explicitly lyrical, non-political work. But many more borders were established. Now, interestingly enough, Stalinist cultural figures had a dual role in society and culture. So they obviously, the most obvious function for them would be, of course, to produce Soviet Ukrainian culture of the type that the government wanted, which would be didactic, educational, and would educate the people. Again, a populist moment here. The people need to be educated. The people need to be educated in a certain way, in a certain version of Soviet Ukrainian identity, and this is what the cultural producers do. But that's not the only one. That's not the only one, because they also represent the people before the state, before Stalin. And that, in fact, explains why, during the war and after the war, a number of Ukrainian cultural figures are recruited to serve as ministers, as a speaker of the parliament, as deputy premier, and such. Not because they are going to be particularly good as functionaries, but because they represent the token Ukrainian people who are in power. Of course, the sign that the writers are in power actually means that the Ukrainian people do not have power, because they symbolically represent the people, but they are not the real people. They are also the Stalinist arts officials. Now, in looking at other features of Stalinist culture in Ukraine, one important moment, of course, is that it's a culture which is officially seen as having been closely related to the Russian culture. No more trips to Berlin. I'm sorry, I couldn't refrain from this joke. No more trips for Berlin, which used to be fairly common in the 1920s. Almost every Ukrainian cultural figure would go to Berlin to discover what modern cinema or modern theater or modern literature is all about, or modern art in the case of Dovzhenko and many others. But no, now trips to Moscow. Trips to Moscow to study under the guidance of the Russian cultural figures and to demonstrate your achievements during the regular, more or less regular festivals called the Decade of Ukrainian Art. And that doesn't mean the decade in English, it actually means 10 days. The 10-day festival of art, which is seen as the most important representation, the most kind of responsible event of the year, where you have to portray yourself at your best, and in a way, required by Stalinist state. And because you also go to Russia, you are required to represent a very close connection to the Russian culture. But it gets beyond that, especially during the post-war period, when Ukrainization of the 1920s and early 30s appears a distant past. In 1943, the Red Army is about to retake Kharkiv, the first important Ukrainian city it's going to retake from the Nazis. And just before taking Kharkiv, Khrushchev organizes a meeting of cultural officials, poets, and some generals as well, in a small village of Pomirki near Kharkiv. And the aim of this meeting is to establish the new directions for the standardization of Ukrainian language. That's fairly interesting, right? Rather than thinking about the problems that could potentially develop for the Red Army and will develop repeatedly, especially in the attempts to take Kharkiv and then abandon Kharkiv and then take Kharkiv again, Khrushchev concentrates on the issues of Ukrainian language. Why would that be? Well, that's because on the occupied territory, obviously, there were Ukrainian nationalists present. And the Soviet authorities do not necessarily have a clear idea of what the relations between the German occupational administration and the Ukrainian nationalists were in the second period of the war, but they want to come with a very clearly marked Soviet version of Ukrainian culture. And from this meeting in Pomirki, miraculously, we have a photograph of this meeting. From this meeting in Pomirki, the entire trend develops in Ukrainian language studies. It begins, first of all, with the new Ukrainian grammar and the survey of contemporary Ukrainian language by Bulakhovsky in 1951, the Russian-Ukrainian dictionary in 2 volumes from the Institute of Ukrainian Language, co-edited by Kalinovich, Bulakhovsky, and Rylsky. And we do know that Rylsky, in fact, was, so he was not just a figurehead, a nice poet, a nice name to be added. He was, in fact, working on this particular dictionary. So now, in looking back at 1948, and apparently even already in the 60s, Ukrainian language specialists were calling this dictionary, instead of the Russian-Ukrainian dictionary, Russian-to-Russian dictionary, because the version of Ukrainian represented there was so close to Russian, especially in contrast to previous dictionaries, that it appeared as a major change in cultural policy. And that's what it was. That's why Khrushchev had together the language scholars and writers in the village of Pomirki. Okay, so having said this, it was difficult for Soviet authorities. It was impossible, really, to create a Soviet Ukrainian culture which would be completely separate, separated by a wall from the nationalist Ukrainian culture. They did share a lot of things, and also these things were fundamental in character. They were not marginal. So the concept of the people, the Ukrainian people, the person of Taras Shevchenko as the prophet and the national bard, these were the shared components both in nationalist and a Soviet narrative. So fundamentally, they always existed in dialogue, even so it was supposed to be an antagonistic dialogue, but nevertheless it was there. The additional worry for the Soviet authorities was, of course, the actual presence of nationalist insurgents after the war and during the war. And before the war, the Eastern Galician territories incorporated into the Soviet Union under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They already brought the element of alien Ukrainianness, non-Soviet Ukrainianness into the general stream of Soviet Ukrainian culture. So it's not incidental, of course, that the first thing the Soviets do when they incorporate Eastern Galicia is print lots of copies of the short course of party history in Ukrainian and send something like 40,000 teachers and cultural administrators there, because the Ukrainian culture on the ground does exist, but that's not the Ukrainian culture they want. So ultimately, it's forever ambivalent when you speak of Ukrainian culture, and it's impossible to establish separation. So much so, in fact, that Soviet censors get frustrated. There's a chief censor of literary works in Soviet Ukraine, a fellow by the name Kost Polonnik. He's also a writer, a playwright, actually. In fact, interestingly enough, he specializes in light-hearted entertainment, comedies, musical comedies. Very interesting genre for a chief censor, isn't it? So he, at one meeting, says, well, at least under the Tsars, there was a statute of censorship, which clearly enumerated when you have to ban the work. Would it not be nice, he says, to recreate the statute of censorship? And he actually even has a proposal of 18 points that could go into the statute. But it's never created, of course, because the party line itself keeps changing, and the party line keeps changing in particular on the all-important issue of nationalities. Now, the way then the Soviet Ukrainian culture develops, it does share certain features with Soviet Stalinist culture in general, and let me enumerate some of them. It's the grand style. The grand style which demands opera to be the most important of theatrical and musical arts, which demands a collective epic poem to be the most important literary genre, or a didactic novel to be the most important prose genre, which envisages monuments to all the important cultural figures. That the first thing, in fact, what Stalinist authorities do in Ukraine after destroying the independent thought and the former political rivals, in the late 1930s, they construct monuments to Shevchenko. That's precisely the point. We have won. Now we are going to create a canon of Soviet Ukrainian cultural heritage, which is going to be represented by socialist realist looking, if you exclude the first monument. The first monument in Kharkiv was more complex, but the others are kind of more typical Stalinist socialist realist monuments. And also, the war isn't over yet in 1944, when the Soviet Ukrainian authorities approve a plan to codify and publish the heritage, the legacy of all the major Ukrainian writers in two formats. One format, collected works in several volumes, or in some cases, whatever, several dozen volumes, but of course, purged of any Western connections, of anything which can be seen as nationalistic now, and emphasizing the connection to Russia. And it's the first series. And the second series, the collective farm library, one volume works of every important Ukrainian writer, past and present, which is dumped down version, kind of really simplified version, even more highly censored, and even with more revealing didactic introductions. Of course, the Stalinist state, especially after the war, doesn't have the resources for that, really, but that is the plan. And so these are the features which are more or less shared with, let's say, Russian Stalinist culture. But here's something else. The real test of mass culture under Stalin is actually a popular mass song. They usually come from Stalinist movies. They're very often written by Ukrainian composers. They are, in fact, popular. People are singing them. They are the Stalinist equivalent of pop culture. And then the interesting thing is that there was no mass popular Stalinist song in Ukrainian, interestingly enough. There were plenty written. Every major Ukrainian composer wrote a song which was called a song about Stalin. In some cases, it was about our dear father. In the case of Philip Kozytsky, and that melody was actually later used for the Soviet Ukrainian anthem in the late 1940s, the song about our dear father. But none of them were truly popular, really. Everybody was singing songs from Russian movies. What does it tell us? Well, there was popular Ukrainian song. There was actually popular Ukrainian song in the movies, except it was a folk song. The Soviet authorities insisted in Ukrainian movies on introducing authentic, quote unquote, Ukrainian folk songs in order to stress the national specificity of Ukraine. There's a funny episode in 1951 when the movie Taras Shevchenko is being made, when the party boss in Ukraine, Comrade Melnikov, who doesn't even speak Ukrainian, insists on introducing into the film one particular Ukrainian folk song, which he claims is the favorite Ukrainian song of Comrade Stalin's. And for those of you in Ukraine, Oi zakuvata siva zazula. That was allegedly Stalin's favorite Ukrainian folk song, which was duly introduced into the film. And you get lots of Ukrainian folk songs in the films of the time. And obviously they are popular, but they are not modern. Now, the modern mass culture speaks in the language that is Russian. There's actually a musical film made in 1935-36, Ukrainian songs on screen, but they are the folk songs. So the Ukrainian culture then belongs into the past, and this is a very important point, which is never proclaimed directly, but which is nevertheless very much present there. And of course, the culture is not, I'm trying to make a distinction here between the national and ethnic culture. It's the Ukrainian culture under Stalin is not seen as national culture, but rather as ethnic, because the presence of folklorism is allowed and encouraged by the authorities. All the major institutions of Ukrainian folk art are created under Stalin. The dance ensemble, the most famous in Ukraine, the Versky Dance Company, National Academic, whatever it's called now, established in 1937, the same year as Ukrainian cultural figures are being executed in the Russian north. And then, of course, it goes on to receive the Stalin Prize in 1950. The most famous Ukrainian choir, the National Academic, whatever it's called now, named after Veryovka, is established in 1943, just before Stalinist authorities returned to Ukraine. And of course, it goes on to receive the Stalin Prize in 1948. So, folk Ukrainian culture is very much welcome, and it is a safe ethnographic mode, which in a way is similar to kind of the situation before colonization in great many countries, kind of before decolonization. So the process of decolonization in present-day world very often starts with the point that the culture that was allowed to exist, let's say Aboriginal culture here in Canada, it was allowed to exist, but it was cut down to the point of safe ethnographic representation, which really had nothing to do with Ukraine as a state with modern economy and interests of the modern people. These modern languages were in fact Russian and the language of Soviet music. Interestingly enough, the public, how did the public react? How did the public react? That's the most interesting question. We do know now, after research by Yevgeny Dobrenko and others, that socialist realist literature had its readers. That the Soviet people were reading those boring industrial novels. We have testimony of the Soviet writer Mykola Rudenko, who later became prominent Ukrainian dissident, that he wrote a production novel which also had some love intrigue. And it was a stunning runaway success. And he himself was thinking, why? My novel is so boring. It's kind of the orthodox, according to all the rules of socialist realism, boring production novel, except there is some love intrigues there. But people were demanding a new edition. He was surprised. So there was indeed, within this narrow field, there was choice as well. And the Soviet readers, some of them were obviously educated already in Stalinist mold. But also, I was lucky to get in the archive some statistics about the Soviet theaters in Ukraine in 1953. And it turned out that in 1953, by far the most important, most successful play staged by Ukrainian theaters was, in fact, Shalmenko-Denshik, kind of little Russian comedy from the 19th century about the street-smart Ukrainian orderly who actually, it's a sort of like a marriage of Figaro put into the Ukrainian situation, but it was a very acceptable Russian imperial comedy. It was perfectly acceptable in the late Russian Empire. And so the fact that it is now not only acceptable, but popular in high Stalinist culture in Ukraine, tell us what? First of all, that people do have a choice. They do not go for the Soviet play. They don't even go for the Western play. They go for the Ukrainian comedy. On the other hand, this is the Ukrainian comedy which fit perfectly well into the Little Russian model. So perhaps the authorities are not all that unhappy that Shalmenko-Denshik is the most important most popular comedies. I could say, oh no, that's too bad. It should really be some Soviet work and whatever. But maybe deep down there they think, okay, that's good. That's a Little Russian comedy too. Of course, Little Russianism can be turned both ways, for the empire and against the empire. But an interesting ambiguity is there. Followed by, if you know Ukrainian literature, by «Дай серце волю, заведе в неволю» and «Ой не ходи Грицик ти на вечорниці», which are both also representatives of 19th century ethnographic theater, which can be seen as non-political. Of the Western plays, Calderon, you do not joke with love. Okay. Of the Ukrainian Soviet plays, without calling names, by Vasil Minko. That's the same Vasil Minko who was not arrested by accident in 1937 when the NKVD arrived into the writer's house in Kharkiv, and they got the wrong floor. So instead of Minko, they actually arrested Vasil Misek, who then argued, I'm not Minko, I'm Misek. To which they said, NKVD doesn't make any mistakes. And so Misek disappeared into the maelstrom of terror, whereas Minko survived to be a boring Soviet playwright. But actually his was the most popular one in 1953. And interestingly enough, it was a comedy about the corrupt and unprincipled deputy minister, right? So it was actually an allowed critique of the authorities, which I think he wrote as a response to the Leningrad case, possibly, but could be seen in 1953 as also signaling some kind of de-Stalinization, even so it is boring Soviet play if you look at it now. It's actually a satirical play too, which also makes one think, okay, so Ukrainians only really want comedy, really, that's all they do. Okay, so it sort of sends a signal of a certain niche, the niche culture, which cannot extend into modern mass songs, but can and is supposed to include the traditional component of folklorism. And then finally, getting close to my final points, whether it's a European culture is an interesting question. Not in the sense of Khvylyovy and other Ukrainian figures of the 1920s. To them, you go to Europe for European culture, and you go famously away from Moscow, quote unquote. But if you look at Stalinist culture, the traditional symmetrical architectural designs, wedding cake architecture of Khreshchatyk in Kiev, the opera is the most important genre, the didactic novel, the importance of family, the husband being the head of the family, that does bring to mind 19th century bourgeois European culture. So it is, in a way, European, except it's not modern European. And modern European is actually something which is vigorously denounced by Soviet figures, by both ideologues and officials. There's one tiny window left for modern European culture, and that's the window of translation. So Stalinist culture would never acknowledge the connection to 19th century bourgeois Europe, and yet it is obviously there for all of us to see. And there's one book now at the proof stage arguing that the solution was really that the Stalinist authorities felt that that was the eternal style, that the classical and neoclassical was for eternity. So they were not imitating the 19th century, but building their own architecture and art in that form because they believed that form would survive forever. An interesting explanation I have yet to digest. Okay, and also, what about the resistance from below? I guess it has to be my final point. There is a resistance from below, and this resistance is manifested in a variety of ways. First of all, there is street culture. There are palaces of culture at various factories and districts that are primarily occupied, if you look at the district level archives, primarily occupied by showing movies and holding dances, because this is what the people want. Show the movies, have a dancing party, rather than kind of solemn concert with songs about Stalin. That just doesn't work. Then there is an enormous popularity of Ostap Vyshnya, the humorist who survives the Gulag, comes back in 1944 on personal request of Khrushchev, as a matter of fact, is one of very few people who are able to make it, because Khrushchev wants to bring back some Ukrainian culture. It's a kind of curious type of Ukrainian culture to be brought back as well, because it is humorous and satirical, and therefore dangerous for the Soviet power, but also the satire. Vyshnya understands very well that he now has to satirize Ukrainian nationalism. That's what he does. Yet his popularity does not abate. It is enormous. When he dies in 1956, it's the largest crowd at a funeral in Kiev, which people remember in their lifetimes, because the Stalin funeral is not really a Kievan event, even so it is an even bigger crowd. But then, if we see that as resistance, we should also probably say that after he dies, the two most important representatives of this genre become Stepsel and Tarapunka, who actually start working together in 1946 as a duo of comical stand-up comedians, one of them Russian-speaking, the other Ukrainian-speaking, intentionally speaking a kind of dumbed-down village version of Ukrainian. So whether this is part of Vyshnya or not is a big question. But it actually tells us that this culture of laughter can be not only subversive, but it can also be subversive of your own culture. So if you laugh at a country bumpkin Ukrainian, then this kind of laughter culture is actually very Stalinist laughter culture. And it perhaps is telling that the immense popularity of Tarapunka and Stepsel as a stand-up comedian duo extends well into the late Soviet period. And with this, there is of course a jazz, which everybody cannot get enough of. So much so that at certain point authorities even allow, this is in my most recent book, even allow to play jazz during the Stalinist elections at the polling station. So after people vote, they go to listen and dance to jazz music. How does it sit together? I just voted for Stalin. Now give me some jazz, right? And there is, of course, the Western movies captured usually in Germany or Austria at the end of the war, and then shown illegally to the Soviet audiences, including the famous Tarzan, which one Russian dissident claimed was the most important element in developing a cultural opposition, that everybody loving Tarzan, the American movie, in post-war Soviet Union. So there isn't this current of non-Soviet popular culture, but it does not really undermine, it really coexists, and the authorities are aware of that. It coexists with the official variety of culture. And in the end, though, we have to be careful with thinking about the mass reception, but we do know for fact that Stalinist mass culture was also popular, except this mass culture, as I said, functioned in an interesting register. It was Russian in the important moments of modernity, but it was Ukrainian and folkloric in the moments referring specifically to Ukrainian nationality, which then itself implicitly belonged to the past. And let me add with another note from Oles Honchar's dictionary, actually two notes. One, he says that Ticina, soon after the suicides of 1933, exclaimed publicly at a meeting of Ukrainian writers, so should all of us commit suicide by shooting or hanging? And to Honchar, that's the mark when Ticina and his generation decides to become complacent, decides to become pro-Stalinist, and they cannot stop being so. But then, in the 1960s, another representative of this generation, Maxim Rylsky, together with a group of younger Ukrainian writers, those we now know as the 60ers, attends an event in Moscow where Khrushchev denounces bourgeois culture and some modernist trends in Soviet culture. So there's then a break, and the concert is to follow. In the break, a group of younger Ukrainian literary critics and writers are standing together eating sandwiches. Rylsky comes to them, he's a senior figure, winner of all prizes, big name, and says to them in Russian, "Ну что, легко отделались?" So we got off easily, they didn't attack us. And this younger crowd looks at him in disbelief, not only because he assumes that at every event, every authority figure is going to attack Ukrainians and there will be consequences, but also because he says this in Russian. Even so, he is speaking to a very close group of Ukrainian cultural figures who clearly would prefer a conversation in Ukrainian. More than one of them then writes this episode into the memoirs, because to them, this is an example of difference. They are not prepared for compromises. They are going to put up a fight, at first in the name of Soviet Ukrainian culture, later in the name of universal values. So they do not accept this language, they reject it. And this is the point on which I wanted to end this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Yekelchyk, for that extraordinarily wide-ranging and thought-provoking talk. We now have some time, 20-25 minutes for questions. Please raise your hand. You click on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, or physically raise your hand if you prefer. Or if you really don't want to raise your hand and speak, please write in the chat and I'll read your question out. So it seems to me it's a subject on which everyone will respond slightly differently because so complex. Andrew, would you like to start?
Yeah, dear colleagues, I'm starting hoping just to provoke even more responses. So first of all, thank you so much, dear Serhy. I find your talk extremely interesting and I've made a lot of notes, and I should say it's pretty close to what I'm thinking of writing now. But before asking some questions, making comments, I would like to especially thank you for 2 points I like a lot. So the first one is, of course, about Berlin in the 20s and its relevance. I've completely confirmed it. It's a fascinating topic for special research, dear colleagues, to look at the images and influences of Berlin and German culture on all those people we've talked about, including Ostap Vyshnya, for instance, who also visited Berlin, and name it, really all of them. So that's very helpful. Yeah, it's kind of a task for us maybe. And secondly, it's maybe a joke, but now I'm not sure whether it's a joke or a very sad joke. So Serhy, you said that Ukrainians, also in Stalinist times, they somehow wanted comedy, preferred comedy. And one could speculate that maybe they prefer it till nowadays with all the consequences it brings. that's really, that's kind of, maybe a non-historical observation that could have even a terrifying, consequences maybe. But thank you for, for saying that, indeed. Now, listening to you, I've been asking myself all the time, and now I'm asking you, whether or how are you going to include Viktor Petrov's texts in your, let's say, analysis? Because, accidentally today, I've reread his famous text about Ukrainian cultural figures, victims of the regime. It exists in different versions, at least 3 of them. And it was first published in 1955. when Petrov already was a legalized Soviet archaeologist again, but the text, as far as I see it, was written during the Nazi occupation, so most probably in Kharkiv in 42, 43. And actually, it's amazing that he reflects on what we are talking tonight, like, for instance, the switch in Tychina and Rilsky, personal strategies, like the phenomenon of oppressed culture and so on. Actually, it's very interesting for me because you spoke about the culture of the saved, the culture of the frightened. Petrov spoke mostly about the culture of the executed, of the people who were killed, and this metaphor we know also from later publications. But actually, I think this idea of the culture of the frightened, it's nice. It also helps to explain a lot about, let's say, Ukrainian Soviet historiography, or history writing, in this sense. So I'm just curious how you see Petrov in this context, because you see, like, he's kind of, on the one hand, a participant of these events himself, especially in the 1930s. And then he's someone who analyzes this story afterwards. And at the same time, he has this incredible, like, personal story of survival, like surviving the repression, surviving Stalinism, being alive, again, and like maybe Ostap Vyshny to some extent, returning from the Gulag. That's first. Secondly, I think it's very interesting issue, this like public or non-public denouncing of each other, because we could also find such examples in the stories of people who later emigrated. I mean, during the war, of course, No, let's give him like one name, like Alexander Globulin, a prominent Ukrainian American historian who denounced himself and his colleagues in the 1930s, and then he emigrated, he lived in West Germany, in the US, and he reflected on his own experience at the Soviet time, which is very fascinating, because, for instance, Rilsky, as we know, Rilsky or some others, they were never allowed to do that, at least openly, and some people were. And I was really for me, it was incredibly interesting reading Globulin's explanations of his own behavior back then in the 1930s, when he escaped repressions, being very much, let's say, like a pro-Soviet historian, even though he stayed in Kyiv and then he emigrated to the US. And of course, I liked a lot this idea about Ukrainian being like reserved for ethnographic and safe narratives and so on. It's really fascinating. In this respect, also one could mention that still in let's say after Stalin's death, in early Khrushchev years especially, we have those attempts of rehabilitating people like Zerov, for instance. We have a book of Zerov published in the 60s. But it went not too far. So Khvylevy was not rehabilitated. Many other people also not. So it remained kind of like in between. And it was rather ethnographic. As you rightly said, I would also like follow this logic. Maybe, Serhy, maybe first of all, maybe like apart from Petrov, maybe you could also tell us something about how to call it. No, let's call it like Russian or Russian language culture in Stalinist Ukraine. Because it's an interesting, funny story how Rilsky started spoke Russian in this situation. But as we know, there were some scholars, also writers, who used both languages, or preferred even Russian, still living in Ukraine. We could give some names, like, let's say, Viktor Nekrasov, for instance, so is there like any tension here? In other words, like, what does it actually mean? It's a very interesting question to me. What does it actually mean being Ukrainian Soviet, let's say, writer or filmmaker or historian? What actually, like, what makes you Ukrainian Soviet? Just Ukrainian language you sometimes use in your writing, or maybe even location, maybe some personal stories behind it. I don't know. And how this switch, let's say, from Ukrainian to all Soviet culture. Because again, you see, I'm very interested, like, why not so many people actually manage to do that? And if so, like, usually this switch meant, of course, the abundance of Ukrainian, the acceptance of Russian language. even though there are some probably exceptions, like Dovzhenko, for instance, yeah, who was like both Ukrainian and all Soviet big figure, yeah, in Stalinist time. So maybe you could reflect a little bit on it, and I hope you have more questions to come. And thanks a lot again for your talk.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Andrei. And I also see some good questions in the chat. But let me start with answering briefly to your comments. Russian could also be empowering, actually, in a situation in which a Ukrainian writer takes a novel to Moscow and publishes there. And there are a few precedents, actually, of that, Moscow or Leningrad. When the Ukrainian authorities subsequently wake up and realize, oh, but the novel has been published in Russian in Leningrad, and they didn't know that we still have so many ideological issues with this writer. I think there are possibly two cases like that. It could be Ivan Kocherha, and the second one I don't quite remember, but it's actually in my book on the Stalin's Empire of Memory. So it actually did work for some people, but it made Ukrainian officials really upset. So it's not just the culture of bilingual Ukraine, which is in itself a really colonizing moment from our point of view today. But interestingly enough, Pomirki does not, we may well assume that that was already the discussion in Pomirki in 1943. That we need to acknowledge the role of Russian in Ukraine, but it does not happen in the short run. And the reason it doesn't happen in the short run, I deal with that in a different chapter, which was actually written for the exhibit at Pinchuk Art Center, but the booklet resulting from the exhibit apparently was never published. But it has something to do with Western Ukraine and with the decisions taken by the Soviet authorities in the late 1940s, when they realized that an attempt to really impose Russian on Western Ukraine produces resistance. Because in the late 1946-47, Lviv becomes basically a Russian-speaking city to a significant degree. And in social composition, it is similar to your Andrei favorite Dnipropetrovsk. But that does not seem to be working, because even the Soviet Ukrainian writers, very famously Galan, Yaroslav Galan, object, saying, look, even in Kiev, you can have Zalezhnechny district, but in Lviv, it is Zhelezno-Dorozhny district. So even on city cars, on trams, the destination is shown as Zhelezno-Dorozhny rather than Zalezhnechny. And that's too much. And that really provokes resistance. And so the decision taken in the late 1940s in connection with collectivization, also campaign in Western Ukraine, was to allow them, the press and the media in Ukrainian, to require the educational institutions to, which by the way, in the late 1940s, teach overwhelmingly in Russian in Lviv, to switch to teaching in Ukrainian. And that produces a very interesting sociological effect. But that, as I said, in a different chapter, because when in the 1950s and 60s, the young people show up from the countryside to start working in the new factories, to receive education at the new universities, they encounter the Ukrainian culture. And so this creates an effect of the Ukrainian culture lasting in the West. But at the same time, in Kiev in the 1950s, Kornichuk very prominently, but also the Institute of the Ukrainian language, push the concept of, how do they call it? Harmonious bilingualism in Ukraine, which is intended, and this is in connection with Khrushchev's drive of the late 1950s to build communism, and under communism, everybody is going to speak Russian. This harmonious bilingualism in Ukraine, which causes resistance even from this Stalinist classics, the generation of Ukrainian revolution, which remolded itself really to be Stalinist classical writers, but even they resist to harmonious bilingualism. So it may well be that that was the intention already in Pomirki in 1943, but it really only is implemented in the 1950s. And then there is some pushback, and then there are ideological campaigns, because the language is an important marker here, really. If you delete the language, then there is no point in the sacrifices of the Ukrainian cultural figures. If they have sacrificed so much in order to remain the Ukrainian elite, you cannot take the language of them because they are not necessary. Let me give you a very interesting example, which I forgot to mention in my talk. The most famous socialist realist novel in Russian literature is, of course, How the Steel Was Tempered by Nikolai Ostrovsky. Originally, the first draft was written in Ukrainian. Nikolai Ostrovsky was a Ukrainian person from Volhynia, Ukrainian-speaking person. But when the team of Moscow writers arrived to work with this disabled veteran to improve his text, it all switched into Russian and became the most famous Russian Soviet novel. So in the way in which it exists now, it is difficult to imagine it being written in Ukrainian. Why? Because it does not include any Ukrainian components. We grew accustomed to identify as Ukrainian components because we kind of digested that Soviet Ukrainian literature. There is no ethnic dimension whatsoever. He does not really think of Ukraine as such. It is a text which addresses these Soviet issues. It is also an important text, which they wanted, Stalinist ideologues wanted to make it an important text. And an important text cannot be an ethnic text for a variety of reasons. It has to speak the language of modernity. It has to leave ethnic belonging behind as part of the past. And therefore, it has to be in Russian, even so the first draft was in Ukrainian. But then again, it did not become a model. Not all the Ukrainian writers switched into Russian after the publication of this novel. Ukrainian culture continued to exist, except it continued to exist in a certain niche, in a certain form, in a certain mode. Before we totally run out of time, let me see,
yes,
Andrei, which one would you like me to answer?
Please.
Oh, is it Ursula? I'm sorry. Ursula.
Okay. It's okay. Could you possibly answer the question, let's get this in the right order, from Ivan Kozachenko, and then from Irina Sklokina, and then there was a hand up from Alexei Isakov, and then we'll go to Claudia Date. So Ivan Kozachenko's question in the chat that I think you can all see about the...
Oh, okay. All right. Ivan knows that I'm also writing a book about something else. So he's asking a question about that other book. I don't know actually what was the first monument constructed in Kharkiv after occupation, after the Red Army retook it. But I do know that the first large permanent monument to the liberation of a major Ukrainian city was constructed in Donetsk. That was the first precedent. And I think the next one was in, of all places, Uzhgorod. For an interesting reason too, because that was the territory newly incorporated. Therefore, it needed a major monument. With monuments, as I do know from my book on Stalinist Empire of Memory, the thing with monuments is that they are very expensive. And according to the Soviet practice, they are not funded by the local authorities, at least until the 50s and 60s. Under Stalin, they're always funded from the all-union budget. But that means you need to submit your request. And that means they're going to prioritize certain things. So why in Donetsk, I don't quite know, but I have a guess, because once that must be connected to Khrushchev's pet project of the young guard, Molodaya Gvardia, because he really worried about the image of Ukrainians as abandoning Soviet principles when living under the Nazi occupation. He really worried about nationalistic Ukrainians. So he wanted to mark right away the liberation and to mark right away resistance as the representation of a civilian experience under Nazis. But I don't actually know. I haven't studied Kharkiv in this relation. I'm sorry, Ivan. Irina?
Yes, may we move on to the question from Irina?
Yes.
Possibly I should read it out briefly. I think we usually do that. Thank you very much for the great lecture. I'd like to know if you plan to include the issues of resources and financial flows as a factor for the history of Ukrainian Stalinist culture.
Yeah, I left it out of this lecture, but I do know something about it. So all theaters struggle under Stalin, for instance, interestingly enough. So they receive a subsidy, and every year there's a plan to decrease the subsidy, but every year the subsidy needs to be increased. And that is connected to a fundamental contradiction of Soviet ideology, which claims that the readers and the theater goers must be interested in the most current Soviet plays about our Soviet experience. But the opposite is the case. So the theaters are forced to include more contemporary Soviet material, but it's not popular at all. And also about the books, these extensive publication programs were usually not carried out in the next even decade. So I use them as more as indication of what they wanted to do, but that didn't actually happen. It took much longer because the state's priorities were elsewhere. But nevertheless, at the same time, as you see, the first thing was to create this Khor Veryovki as soon as Ukraine is liberated. So the main principles had to exist, like monuments to Shevchenko. I think the first major monument to be restored in all of Ukraine is the monument to Lenin. Is a new monument to Lenin in Kiev by Merkurov, the statue which was previously at the New York World Exhibit and such. So Lenin has to come first. Interestingly enough, not Stalin, because otherwise you would have to ask Stalin to fund a monument to Stalin, which is very awkward. So there is never a permanent monument to Stalin built in Kiev after the war. So Khrushchev subsequently claims that this is because he was always secret closet anti-Stalinist. But that's not the reason really, but this is what he claims in the 50s. So there is the resources and financial flows.
May we turn now briefly to Oleksiy Isakov, and then we'll go back to the questions in the chat. I'm aware that we're due to finish in a couple of minutes, but we'd love to keep you here for as long as possible. So maybe we can stay for a little longer, if that's all right. I think there's more to be said. So Oleksiy.
Thank you very much, Ursula, and thank you so much, Dr. Yekelchyk, for your talk. I'll try to be short. I'm just still thinking of what you said about creating a canon of Ukrainianness in the late 30s by Stalin, and also about this Ukrainian culture in a way of safe ethnographic representation. I was reading a book on Shizdesyatniki, on the 60s, where it's more a memoirs book, and there was a sentence there that among the 60ers, there were, for example, Mikhailina Kotybinska, the niece of Mikhailo Kotybinsky, and one of the granddaughters of Ivan Franko, who were involved into the 60ers movement, but they had this kind of immunity. They were not allowed to be touched or not to be harmed in a very bad way, because they were connected to this Ukrainian culture, probably the ethnic Ukrainian culture or the classics of Ukrainians. And my thought was that this somehow appeared after Stalin's death. And now I'm really surprised that you say already in the 30s, it began to be formed, some kind of canonized Ukrainianness with some good Ukrainians, although at the same time, all the repressions and the Red Renaissance and everything happened in the 30s. So my question would be, were there any points according to which Ukrainian, let's say, writer or artist would be considered a good Ukrainian, which was, which suited into the canon, and on the other side, bad Ukrainians in a way which were repressed or forgotten or brought away from this whole concept of Ukrainianness? Thank you very much.
It's a very good question. Thank you. Very briefly, he or she would have to denounce the Ukrainian nationalists abroad. And this is in a way similar to what is happening to the Jewish intellectuals in post-war Stalinist culture, because too much of a connection is established with foreign Jewish organizations, and then the state of Israel is created. And so they become targets precisely because they are affiliated with the abroad. And so the Ukrainian cultural figures need to constantly denounce us in Canada here, and in the United States, and in West Germany. And even so, when they go on trips, they're actually very well received. Not in the United States of the 50s, though, but kind of they have to maintain Sovietness of the Ukrainian identity. Very briefly on the relatives of big names, that's not always the case in the 1930s. They can be repressed. Very famously, Petro Franco is executed in Kiev in 1941 when they cannot possibly move him to Russia. But it's the issue of establishing that the Ukrainianness is a Soviet one. Now, very quickly here, Claudia, yes, there was a well. First of all, there was a wartime.
I should interrupt you very briefly just to say that we don't have to rush. It's okay if you can stay with us for a bit longer. We don't have to take. We can take the time that we need for the remaining questions, Dr. Yekelchyk, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, there was the wartime edition of Shevchenko's Kobzar, which was actually designed for the occupied territories and was parachuted into the occupied territory of Ukraine. I haven't seen much evidence that it was popular or anything like that, but obviously it was kind of a very select vision of what to include. Primarily the points where Shevchenko speaks about Germans in a not so nice way, and where he speaks about the need to defend Ukraine and things like that. But at the same time, I think there was the academic edition, the so-called academic edition of Shevchenko being prepared, I think, right after the war. And that would be very interesting to look at it. I am not aware of work being done on that, but you know, most recently, 150th anniversary of Lesia Ukrainka was marked, and in connection with that, the new complete quote-unquote edition of her works appeared in Ukraine, and some people said, wait a minute, what about the translation of Das Kapital? And then on social networks, a huge cultural war started, saying, no, she never translated Das Kapital. She didn't want to translate, or even if she wanted to translate, she did not translate. And so the translation included in the Soviet edition was falsification. But of course, by insisting so much that she was not involved with that, that's also our present day way of kind of creating our own Lesia Ukrainka, kind of a Lesia Ukrainka who was not social democrat, which she was, right? So, so we're constantly reimagining the classics of Ukrainian literature and culture in a new and different way. And yes, indeed, in Soviet editions, they insisted that, or was it the Manifesto of the Communist Party? Perhaps I'm confused. Perhaps it was the Manifesto of the Communist Party that she writes in one letter that it would be good to translate. I'm bringing the translation with me when I travel. What does she mean? Is it her translation or not? So the current orthodoxy is it's not her translation. She never wanted, she would never want to translate Marx. Who is this Marx fellow anyway? So, okay.
The next one is just a comment from Clementi Fedevich, a short remark about Ostrovsky. There is Shevchenko Kobzar on show demonstrated in his Moscow Flat Museum, which was constantly on the nightstand close to him. And is still... That's
a very good comment. Thank you so much. That only indicates that there was a Ukrainian part to his identity, but also that Kobzar did not challenge the Soviet identity. Again, Oles Gonchar is traveling by train to one of the socialist satellites of the Soviet Union during the post-war period. Don't remember quite which country they go to, but all the writers and cultural figures in one carriage, and in the other one there is Voroshilov, that's his personal one. And so Voroshilov invites Gonchar for tea, or maybe not just tea. And in a long conversation, it transpires that Voroshilov carries with him the Kobzar. So he shows, here's, I carry with me my Shevchenko, which of course doesn't make him Ukrainian patriot, but it also turns out that he knows lots of poems by heart, lots of Shevchenko's poems by heart, and that's quite shocking to Gonchar. But Voroshilov tells to him, oh, it's okay, I went to Prosvita meetings before the revolution, which is even more shocking because, of course, in Soviet times, the Ukrainian Prosvita societies are the bourgeois nationalistic. You should never ever acknowledge that you ever went to a Prosvita meeting. But here's this high Soviet official, and Stalin's Minister of Defense tells you, I'm also Ukrainian, secretly Ukrainian. If you keep the door closed, I'm also Ukrainian. Here's my Kobzar, which is okay, right? So Ostrovsky was never fully erased as Ukrainian. What I do say is that this novel was never perceived as a Ukrainian novel in the Soviet Union. It was intentionally a Soviet novel about a formative Soviet experience. And I'm with you on that he was a Volhynian fellow who probably spoke better Ukrainian than Russian. Or he spoke a Surzhyk, which was neither Ukrainian nor Russian, most likely.
Thank you. Next question in the chat from Alexander Avramchuk. Oh, and I see a hand raised. We'll come back to you, Irina. From Alexander Avramchuk in the chat. Thank you for this fascinating talk. When did this mystique connection between Ukrainian Soviet cultural figures and Stalin begin to form? Was it at the famous 1929 Stalin's meeting with a delegation of Ukrainian writers? And do you see any changes in the nature of this connection since then?
No, it was a different one. I also have a talk on which is available on YouTube, which I gave as a Danilo Husarstruk annual memorial lecture at the University of Toronto about the 1929 meeting, which of course is yet another chapter in the book. But that was the moment when they realized that they didn't have a common language, that something was wrong, that they were not reading the signals. And these people would have to be arrested, they would have to disappear. And the new crop of Soviet Ukrainian cultural figures would come to Moscow in 1936. And the descriptions of this meeting in both the archival material and the newspapers coincide. 1929 was confrontation, arguing with Stalin, but basically also arguing at cross purposes, not really truly understanding each other, arguing about the proper notion of Sovietness or Soviet Ukrainianness. In 1936, descriptions are like, we walk into the Kremlin and the sun is shining brightly at us. This is Stalin. We walk closer and closer to the sun. And really, that's what it is, right? So that is the type of kind of visiting the great leader to be affirmed in our Sovietness. Whereas 1929 is very much alive, it's confrontation. It's not, and when I was given that talk in Toronto, I think some people in the audience assumed that these are the writers who are anti-Soviet, but no, they're actually the Soviet writers and officials who don't quite understand what Stalin wants of them. And Stalin doesn't quite understand why they attack him because of Bulgakov. Because the purge of Ukrainian culture went through two stages. First, the cultural figures of the old days, those who fought against the Russian Empire, those who carried the mantle of a national prophet, the successors of Shevchenko, people like Hrushevsky and Yefremov. And many of them ended up in the trial of the Union for Liberation of Ukraine. But that's the pre-revolutionary group. Now, the second stage was, and I think I'm going to give a talk in Toronto on that later this month, actually. Now, the second stage is quite different. It's the socialist Ukrainian writers and cultural figures who are getting arrested in the 1930s. But this is because they represent the legacy of the Ukrainian Revolution and the 1920s. So they represent this notion of decolonization, using today's term, because the Ukrainization is really decolonization. So when it is abandoned, it means it's a return to Russian imperial models at some point. So they too end up being arrested and executed because this is not the language Stalin can accept. And then there's a new group of promotees, notably represented by Kornichuk, I have to say, and then which is subsequently joined by some representatives from West Ukraine, like Lubomir Dmitarko, and then the post-war generation, the Oles Honchar generation, which also joined this group. They see Stalin as like Stalin is God. You don't argue with Stalin. You just present yourself in the best possible light, and this Ukrainian culture you create is for him. There's a collective poem by Soviet Ukrainian writers in 1944 thanking Stalin for the liberation of Ukraine. And at one point in this poem, they actually thank him for bringing the sun. Спасибі за сонце, що ти засвітив. Like, thank you for kind of lighting up the sun, because without you, there would be no sun. There would be no life, no day, nothing. And this is really, truly the moment when mature Stalinism is established, not even in the late 1930s, but kind of the last year of the war, I think.
And that's a nice segue to the next question in the chat from Ihor Andrichuk. He says, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I'd like to go back to the case of Saussure and raise a purely formal question towards your argument. How exceptional or common was it to get an answer from Stalin? Is there any data on the letters that were sent to Stalin and other high-rank party bureaucrats that were ignored or returned with a no? And if yes, will a counterexample of this sort be mentioned in your book?
Well, the point here, I guess, that you have to be a prominent writer in order to be heard. And obviously, Stalin wasn't opening his mail. In fact, the mail addressed to Stalin was opened in the nearest Oblast committee of the Communist Party. Then it was up to the authorities there to forward the letter or not. But rest assured that in the cases when everybody knew about Stalin's answer, there was an actual Stalin's answer. However, there's an interesting detail. Saussure says that his letter, when it arrived to Stalin, contained, in addition to Saussure's letter, a medical document from the mental hospital. So, being a major Ukrainian poet who was having all kinds of troubles, being an alcoholic, having mental issues, I don't know why Stalin became interested in this particular case, but I think somebody in the Ukrainian leadership indicated to him that that's an opportunity when you can show your magnanimity. That's a good opportunity because he would appreciate, right? We do know that Stalin made decisions like that on his own, most notably with Bulgakov, when Bulgakov sent a letter to Stalin and then Stalin called back. And there are other cases like that, but in most, I think in many cases, going into the 40s and 50s, it was moderated by the local authorities. Dovzhenko sent a letter to Stalin in the mid-30s. For Kornichuk already in the late 1940s, Khrushchev is an intermediary. So he interacts with Stalin directly too, but he makes sure that Khrushchev is approving and he knows and he can, or one of the Ukrainian high officials interferes on his behalf before Stalin. Stalin was reading a lot. He was trying to read all the literary journals and all the works nominated for a Stalin Prize. He was a voracious reader, a voracious reader. So he was trying to read a ton, and he also insisted on watching all the Soviet movies before they are released. So there is, in fact, an element here of his personal involvement. Very famously, Viktor Nekrasov, a Russian writer living in Ukraine, who identified with Ukraine in many ways, received his Stalin Prize because Stalin read his novel in a literary journal, In the Trenches of Stalingrad, subsequently a famous novel. We know that Stalin could overrule writers, but he would normally not do so. From the story of Wanda Wasilewska, the Polish writer who actually lived in Soviet Ukraine, being married to Kornichuk, and for all intents and purposes was considered part of Ukrainian literature, except a Polish writer living in Ukraine. Stalin really liked her. This comes up in the memoir by Konstantin Simonov. And at one point during the deliberation of the Stalin Prize Committee, he says, "Comrade writers, what's your opinion? Is Wanda Wasilewska a great writer?" And they said, "No, Comrade Stalin, she's an okay writer." And he was obviously disappointed, but he didn't overrule them. So he had his own personal channels, but they obviously reached only to the most important people. And also going back to this Dovzhenko incident in January 1944, I think Stalin is very well aware that he is setting up a precedent, that people will be talking about what he is doing. So he wants to project his mystique in a way that it would become known to everybody that he intervened and did that. And yet there would be no proof for now of that. And they would not be allowed to publish anything about it. Even so, obviously, everybody would be talking about Stalin did that or said that. And then, of course, some very few of his lieutenants could also serve as symbolic connection to Soviet power. Voroshilov, very notably. In the archive, the literary archive in Kiev, the collection of Ivan Potorzhinsky, the famous operatic singer, contains a huge portrait of Voroshilov with an inscription to Potorzhinsky and Litvinenko Volhymut. On Voroshilov's visit to Kiev, he would always demand that Kiev Opera puts up Zaporozhets za Dunajem. Kind of nice ethnographic, Little Russian, but revised to be patriotic opera in which Potorzhinsky and Litvinenko Volhymut invariably would perform. And so the director of Kiev Opera, who is, by the way, Khrushchev's son-in-law, would have to completely revise the program for the next months in order to put the Zaporozhets za Dunajev, because Voroshilov wants to enjoy safe, ethnographic, nice presentation of Ukraine. And then the artist would keep this portrait on the glass, and the inscription, "My dear friends are singing beautifully as always. Last time I was in Ukraine in the 1930s, they sang beautifully, and they are now singing beautifully." So beautiful. Thank you so much. Of course, the term beautiful is also very telling because it's a colonial term, right?
One last question in the chat from Clementi Fedevich, and then Irina still has her hand raised, and we'll come to you shortly. So Clementi's question: is it possible to evaluate what Soviet national cultures Stalin liked and what cultures he did not like, and which place did Ukraine have in these likes and dislikes of Stalin?
I would have to write a book in order to answer this question completely, and such books have been written, actually. I think it's not really Stalin's personal preference here, but rather the logic of development of Stalinist culture and the Stalinist notion of national identity that invariably leads us to the same list of Ukraine, Belarus, and Georgia, and Armenia. And that's a very suspect list, really, because it's all Christian, with two of them being in the Caucasus. One of them is Stalin's native land. And of course, Ukraine and Belarus not only being Eastern Christian, but also being the closest ethnic relatives of Russians, sometimes seen already in Stalin's time as not really being different at all from Russians, and of course seen in the same way in imperial times. So when I think about it, it really is striking to what degree the Soviet notions of kind of the best, the friendliest groups in the Soviet Union coincides with the Tsarist one. Kind of Ukrainians, Belarusians, because they are really Russians, and Georgians and Armenians because they are Orthodox, because they're Christians, and one can argue about relation to Orthodox Christianity in the Armenian case, but still two Christian nations in the Caucasus. So it's a curious, I think, remnant of Tsarist identity politics there. Thank you so much.
So, dear colleagues, I don't know what happened, but Irina, please ask your question, not to waste time.
Yeah, thank you very much for a great presentation. I was flashed with a with a moment of influence of Stalin in the Ukrainian actually popular culture and popular culture today. So there is this term, I don't know how academical it is, sharovarshina, which was basically it was manifested during Stalinist time, which created this lowbrow, simple image of not educated Ukrainian drinking gorilka, dancing to the high beat, and I don't know, eating salo, and which is translated through very long time till today and still somehow settled so deeply in Ukrainian image what is Ukrainian pop culture is in different kind of arts, and communicating still this somehow basic and not real values and identities of Ukrainians. So somehow I'm assuming that what we have today, the struggle of defining Ukrainian popular culture and developing Ukrainian culture, we have to thank Stalin, and we still have Stalin present today in Ukraine somehow. What do you think about that? Thank you very much.
That's a wonderful, actually, question, which nicely sums up the outcome of my thoughts in this talk. I'm in the process of writing an encyclopedia article on Sharovarshina, commissioned from me by the Historical Encyclopedia of Ukraine. I also have a talk on YouTube, which was recorded in Lviv, which is called Sharovary for Stalin. So, perfect match here. You got the correct person to ask about Sharovarshina. And yes, so the obvious link to Tsarist Little Russian identity, which was not in fact anti-Tsarist, as Clemente Fedevich can show very well, right? That you can be holding your kobzar and wearing the baggy trousers of the Cossacks and dancing and singing, but you could actually be a loyal monarchist. And so in Stalin's time as well, you expected to maintain your ethnic identity, but in a way which is not political, which does not involve speaking about, let's say, the colonial oppression of Ukrainian workers or the Ukrainian famine. And actually, I have to say that Saussure, when he writes his memoir, he actually says that he ended up in the mental hospital in part, in a significant part, because of the famine, because of the Holodomor, because he was on a trip in the countryside and he came back, he couldn't control himself, and then he was attacked by others from a political standpoint. But actually that was a major reason, he says, in a memoir written in Soviet time, he says, for his insanity. That it was what was in fact transpiring in the Ukrainian countryside. So yes, these people were very familiar with the kind of culture they were creating. This is also the same time, late into the war period, the late 1940s after the war, when the term reunification of Ukraine and Russia is reintroduced. And when it is reintroduced at this point, everybody still remembers that that was a Tsarist term. And therefore, you should not use it as a Soviet person because they are not the same nation, they're two different nations. And yet, when it is introduced in an encyclopedia article written by a Ukrainian historian for the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, he is attacked at first by his Ukrainian colleagues, then attacked in Moscow, who say, "Oh, it's illiterate. You cannot use it because," but then everybody accepts it, and so that basically paints a very interesting picture for us, right? It is a return to the Little Russian identity at a different level. A Little Russian identity with the instruments of modern cultural transmission, with cinema, with radio, eventually with television. And of this, the next generation is going to be aware. Because for them, assimilation and Little Russianism are going to be important terms of defining of what they do not want Ukraine to be. So you are completely right.
Thank you very much for that. And now there was a break in my Wi-Fi connection here, so I have one more question from Kirill Tkachenko, but colleagues, please tell me if there's something that I'm missing before that. Kirill says, there is also another parallel between the 19th century Russian Empire and the Stalin period, the one concerning objects of hatred. The same ethnic groups affected by deportations in the 19th and in the 20th century. Small Muslim ethnic groups from the southern Ukraine and Caucasus. So phrased as a comment rather than a question. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that, Dr. Yekelchyk.
I will, but in a way which is not immediately obvious as a response. There was a major enemy in pre-war Ukrainian Stalinist culture, which completely disappears in post-war Ukrainian Stalinist culture, and that is Poland. There are so many plays and movies and everything portraying the struggle of Ukrainian people against the Polish oppressors. The Soviet Union, as we all know, expects an attack from Poland and Germany. That's the Stalinist understanding of what World War II is going to be like. So much of Ukrainian culture in the 1930s is servicing this particular need of Stalinist propaganda, the anti-Polish one, because it also works for the Ukrainian project. It kind of helps build the Ukrainian idea of statehood and separate culture and resistance to oppression, social oppression, national oppression, religious oppression. It works for the Stalinist version of Ukrainian culture. But here is the problem. Poland is going to be a friendly state after the war. And so they discovered early on when plays and operas by Soviet Ukrainian composers and playwrights are stopped in Moscow when a Polish delegation arrives in Moscow. And then Kornichuk has a funny argument. He says, well, but there's a Russian opera Ivan Susanin, where the Poles are also the enemy, but it's still being performed. Why did you stop the opera Bogdan Khmelnytsky? I said, well, you're not the classic of Russian literature and musical culture of the 19th century. So there is a very important transition of enemies. It's now kind of the enemy has to be located completely in the past, unless this enemy is actually a Ukrainian nationalist. So after the war, then a very interesting situation develops. Like the only enemy, okay, foreign enemies consolidate nationhood, right? So if you have a foreign enemy, it's sort of, that's how dictatorships do it. It helps you build your cohesive fortress-like national identity. But when your own contemporary enemy is actually yourself, except living in Canada and the United States, that's a very interesting situation for a cultural identity, which I think is a big issue for the post-war period, for the post-Stalin period. And it is being addressed by scholars as well. Kind of the Ukrainian diaspora becomes your enemy, but you are no longer allowed to have historical enemies.
Thank you. And that's another issue pregnant with the possibility for further discussion, on which I guess we nonetheless have to end for this evening. I feel as if we've barely scratched the surface for all the different ways we could have taken the conversation. Thank you so much, Dr.
It was very productive from my point of view as well, and very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Ursula, for a wonderful moderation.
Thank you all. It's really glad to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. Next week at the normal time of 6 p.m. we have Anastasia Chebotaryova, who from the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, who's going to talk to us about the experience of Jewish women in the Holocaust in Ukraine. Until then, thank you all very much for your inputs, and look forward to seeing many of you again this time next week. And thank you once again, Dr. Yekelchyk, for excellent evening. Thank you.